when Janet asked me, I've been scratching my head for the last several months, wondering what exactly she had in mind. But I think I kind of get an idea of, have an idea of what she was after. And I will tell you this anecdote that back in 2004, when I first took a gardening class and a permaculture class in Houston, I asked the people that were already involved in that what they recommended. And I said, you know, should I do a master gardening class program, or should I go with Urban Harvest? So Urban Harvest is a local organization down there that does very similar work to master gardening. And the answer was, well, if you want to spray pesticides, go with master gardeners. If you want to do the organic way, go with Urban Harvest. So I did. I went with Urban Harvest. And so back then, that was 20 years ago. Whether or not that perception was true and valid, I don't know, because I really didn't, research it a whole lot. But 20 years fast forward to today, the irony is that now I'm teaching IPM for Texas A&M, and it's all about teaching ecological principles. So I am not sure where they began, at what point. I have been in and out of Texas for the last 30 years. And even though I have a degree from Texas A&M, as you heard, I've been out of the state. And so I'm doing my best to put together something that I hope you are interested in, and that is, the conservation trends at A&M. I can say, speaking from, for myself, that we do teach this concept of earth kind gardening, and I go into some detail. I'm not going to actually teach it to you today, but I also thought you may be interested in some of the research that is happening in regenerative agriculture. And so I'm going to touch a little bit on that too. Janet also mentioned that you may not be familiar with what a horticulture agent does. So I'm going to actually start out with that and then go from there. So if you have questions, I'll try to answer them, especially if it comes to the research part, because I was not part of those studies. So anyway, I'm going to real quickly touch on the mission, our Dallas County Extension team, what do I do on a regular basis, and then we'll be talking about those earth kind landscaping principles and the research. Those are 3 different ones that I picked out of the literature search that I did this weekend. So the mission, just in case extension by itself is a new term to you, all land grant universities in every state of the United States has basically 3 arms to it, if you will. They have the academic arm, they have the research arm, and then the final arm is the extension arm. And the idea is to take all the knowledge that is taking place on campus and on different research stations around the state and take it out into the community, right? Because the idea, again, was when all this started back in the late 1800s was, what good is it to just keep all this knowledge to ourselves if we cannot help our communities? So that's what extension is all about, is to take teaching out into the community. And as you can see, I know everything's going to be a little small here, but it's kind of a cross between agriculture, health, nutrition. Those are the main 3 areas. And in addition to that, we do a lot of work with 4-H and youth development. And again, the idea, is to improve the well-being of all individuals, families, business, communities. This is half of our team. I couldn't get the other picture to show up for whatever reason, but this is our director, Xiomara Diaz-Vargas. She started with us last year, and these 3 individuals are all in the family and community health program, and then we have several that are involved in nutrition. Right now, I'm the only horticulture agent, but they have just hired an agriculture agent. He will begin in September. And then we also have a 4-H agent. So if you want any type of programming, 4-H is very similar to FFA, I understand, maybe some slight differences, but it's all about trying to get the kids out into nature and learning how to grow their own, grow own vegetables and raise their own animals. So it's a really fantastic little group. I have been very impressed with them. I didn't know anything about 4-H before I started with Extension. So as far as what I do on a daily basis, you can see this is kind of a mind map just to help me talk real quickly about it. But in-depth teaching programs is what I'm supposed to be focused on most of the year. I have a minimum of 2, maybe a maximum of 3. And then you can see that there are other kinds of programs that I have to develop throughout the year. I am, in theory, well, not in theory, Monica started giggling. I am the Master Gardener Coordinator. But the reason I said in theory is because sometimes I have somebody that helps me to keep that running while I'm, busy with everything else. Right now, I don't have one, but we're hoping to hire one in the near future. And then I do have lots of inquiries that come in via email, via phone. People, asking about their dead grass, asking about, their bush that's very sick looking. So those kind of questions come in all the time. For that, we have a fantastic help desk that runs through the Dallas Master Gardeners, and they really save my life on a weekly basis. I'm very grateful to them. And then you can see that many other kind of interdepartmental things go on a monthly basis, sometimes more so than others. So for example, for 4-H, I just finished the last week of July, we ran a 3-day summer camp for entomology. And so we had kiddos come out and we had them all day, and we just, did a lot of insect collections and talked about all kinds of insect related topics. So I just wanted to go a little bit more into the in-depth teaching programs that I'm currently overseeing. The Master Gardener Intern Program. How many of you are Master Gardeners? I think a lot of you are Master Gardeners in here, right? So for those of you that are not Master Gardeners, we do run a school every year. It's usually in the spring here in Dallas, and it runs about 14 weeks. It's all day long on a given day. And that, of course, I inherited because all horticulture agents have to have a Master Gardener program for the entire state of Texas. So that's something that I'm just trying to improve, trying to see how I can increase our retention for our interns. The second one is the citizen gardening training. It's somewhat similar. I kind of call it the baby sister of the Master Gardener program, but we only teach classes that relate to growing food crops. And so the idea, I'm working with the Human and Health Services Department of the city of Dallas, or Dallas County actually, and they are providing grants to the community to try to increase the number of community gardens in the food desert areas. And in order to receive that money, they have to take this class so that money doesn't go to waste, right? They don't want to be given $3,000 and then they don't know what to do with it, or they half kind of build it, but they need to know everything from the starting point, including, are you going to have volunteers? Are you going to have enough money to sustain this, et cetera, et cetera? So it's a 7-week class. I put it that it's still a pilot project because even though I started it last year, because of the duration, we're finding that people just cannot commit to 7 weeks, especially because a lot of them are working individuals. So I'm going to try a different format this fall. We're going to record all the classes. Those that register will be able to access those recordings, and then we'll hold work days so that people can put into practice what they have heard on the recordings. So I hope that it works better with people's schedules. And again, the idea is to just make more fresh produce available to these food desert areas. The final one that I haven't really gotten much traction on yet, but I hope I do, is to develop a landscape worker curriculum in Spanish. I was just in Houston 2 weeks ago, and I had an opportunity to speak to folks from Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, Kentucky, and they all really agree. I think we're all on the same page that this is sorely needed, because even if a landscape company has a manager and that manager knows how to do things, they may not have the language to then transmit fully all of the information to their workers. And we all know that it's those workers that are really outside doing all the work. And so I may have an opportunity to collaborate with other states Interestingly, Florida already developed something, and I think that sometimes there are small things, right, that you don't think about. And for example, with folks that come up here to work here, they may not know the correct terminology in Spanish for a word that they hear on a regular basis in English, right, when they're out there for a tool, for example. So it kind of tickles me pink, but I may have to develop a Spanglish curriculum. And that's exactly what happened last year when I went to TNLA, which is the Texas Nursery Landscape Association. I went to their Spanish track just to kind of observe and see how it was being taught. And lo and behold, the individual that was teaching it, he was teaching it in Spanglish. So I brought that up to the Florida agent because they have books that are just sitting in offices because apparently the curriculum went nowhere. And it was because these individuals just don't have that technical Spanish. So a lot of research needs to go into this before we get going, but I'm excited about doing that. Of course, I guess I didn't tell you, but I am bilingual because I'm originally from Ecuador, South America. So Spanish is my mother tongue. And so that will be fairly simple, but I do have to find volunteers that can help me. So I'm always looking for volunteers that speak Spanish. All right, let's go into the research. And this is where I'm going to try not to fumble too much. So the first one that I found of interest was, again, this one that's about regenerative agriculture. I think I'm going to call it RA from now on because it's a mouthful. And I thought that before I got started with what A&M is doing, I would just try to explain to you how it's defined. And I came across this paper that was published in 2020, and then Schrieffer and his colleagues actually looked at 28 papers to see if there was a commonality on what was understood as regenerative agriculture from a scientific standpoint. And the answer was there was no commonality. So instead, they ran their statistics and what have you to look at the combinations and variations of objectives and activities, and they recommended a definition that should be adopted by the scientific community. So the main thing is they're saying it's an approach to farming that uses soil conservation as the entry point. That's pretty solid. And the objective would be, of course, to regenerate and contribute to multiple provisioning, regulation, and support of the ecosystem services. Now, this provisioning term, it's kind of an umbrella term for things that will improve the soil health. So soil structure, organic matter, the increase of microbial diversity. So all of those things are kind of falling under that idea of increasing the provisioning of the system. And then the goal is, of course, to enhance not only the environmental, but also social and economic dimensions of the sustainable food production. And this was kind of their main criticism of regenerative agriculture, is that sometimes it's kind of almost like the sustainable term that was taken and it's used very, very loosely, right? But that's why they were very careful to say, let's make sure that at least we're starting with the soil as our entry point. That's the key thing that we want to be worried about. So how do we get there? Well, they have most of the scientists and anecdotally farmers that have used this in the past have used these 5 principles, which is to minimize the soil disturbance, to maintain living roots, to keep the soil covered, to integrate domestic animals, and then also to make sure that you are planting a diversity of crops. So if you think about it, this is kind of the way nature does things, right? So indeed, nature's way, right, is no mechanical disturbance. So, we don't want this to see this in our fields. We want to make sure that there's always armor on the soil, which would be our mulches and what have you. Or it could be cover crops, right? And that helps with the cycling of water. And of course, the cover crops will help to always have living plant root networks, right? We don't have a fallow period the way our grandparents used to farm. Because again, we always are going to think, is this how really nature works? And the answer is there's always something living in the soil, right? And then finally, the nutrient cycling via biology. Well, of course, we've already removed all the bison from our prairies, but so we now have to integrate our domestic animals, but in a ecologically sound fashion. So once again, nature has been doing this for thousands of years. So she has all the research and development. And so we just kind of have to follow her lead. And that is, at the end of the day, what regenerative agriculture is about. It leads to things like environmental services, which we all hear about more and more in the news, right? And so one of those, as just an example, could be that relationship between predator and prey, right? If we have a healthy ecosystem, there are checks and balances, and we do not have to intervene. Nature can take care of its pests by itself. And so you can see here, so I found this kind of an interesting statistic that 1,700 beneficial insect species exist to every one pest species. And this is pretty true. Whenever I teach entomology and IPM, people are always surprised to hear that in our gardens even, only 5% of the insects we see are pests. The rest are either predators or they are parasitoids. And of course, the parasitoids are tiny little wasps that we cannot really see. And so, but a good 95% plus are there to help us. So we just need to make sure that we are helping nature and not hurting it. So this is the current research that is taking place. Texas A&M, they are evaluating now the impacts of regenerative agriculture in a semi-arid ecoregion, that is Texas, West Texas, Panhandle, Oklahoma, right? So what's interesting about this are a couple of things that caught my eye when I was reviewing the paper, and there seems to be not only an awareness, but now there's this, they're admitting that if we're going to be profitable, we kind of have to do it nature's way, right? Regenerative agriculture is not a new concept. It's been around since 70s, I believe. It's kind of ebbed and flowed depending on the decade. When I first became familiar with RA was through the organization that's called Acres. I don't know if anybody has ever been to a conference by Acres. They are kind of the voice of eco-agriculture, if you will, and they've been around for 50 years. The founder, Charles Walters, he had the saying that I love, that is, the saying says, to be economical, agriculture must be ecological, right? And so if you read their descriptions of their study, it says, we want to understand and encourage the widespread adoption of regenerative practices that increase agricultural production and profitability. There's that economical part, right? While reducing agriculture's environmental input. And so or footprint. And so there is that ecological part. So it's kind of, being very fluffy in the way it says things, but in a nutshell, that's what they're admitting. That is the way we have to do it. The other thing that caught my eye is that now they're not really practicing, they're not going to study just one aspect of it, right? And this goes back to science-based, right? And whenever I introduce the mission of A&M, we always say, well, we're science-based, we're evidence-based, et cetera. I kind of feel that as a farmer, sometimes you can't solely make a decision on only science-based results, because by nature, when you are planning an experiment, you're an experimental design, and you come up with a hypothesis, you have to narrow that question a lot in order to be able to make sure that you are not including variables that could kind of muddy the waters, if you will, right? And I'm a fan of scientific method. I mean, it's a great thing, but we also have to admit that we're not in a lab, we're not in a greenhouse. Even sometimes when we do what's called like semi-fields or semi-field studies, they're not quite in the field. Sometimes even that is not real world, right? So it's important that now A&M is saying, okay, well, we have to be careful not to to be very narrow in the scope of our questions and our studies. We have to kind of include everything that's happening out there, right, as much as we can. And so, in effect, that is what they say in their paper, is that they are going to look at the entire agricultural production system that includes the cover crops, the crop rotations, the grazing, and other management techniques. And so this is, in my mind, this is a good thing, because it's not only the basic science handing the baton to the applied science, but it's the applied science of various departments within the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. In fact, it's the Department of Animal Science, the Department of Agricultural Economics, the Department of, Agricultural Engineering, and Soils and Crop Science. So it's bringing everybody to the table and saying, okay, we know this works, but we need to quantify it, because a lot of farmers are resisting adopting this technique. But if they can show with data, not only is it helping the environment, but it's also going to be profitable, then hopefully more and more of these farmers in West Texas will adopt it. The other part of it, well, and I'll just mention real briefly so that you know what these pictures are about. They're going to evaluate soil carbon capture. They're also going to look at greenhouse gas emissions. Over here, they're going to be looking at water behavior. And then, as I mentioned already, they're going to be looking at different types of rotation and grazing and cover crop schemes that will increase the soil health of these areas that have been mined for their elements for decades, right? And so some of them are really in bad shape, and they're trying to see if they can bring that back. What else was I going to say about this part here? I think that might be it. I know that there was something else I was going to say, but I think the only thing I wanted to mention was that when I used to go to the ACRES conferences, to me, what was interesting, and that's where I was going with my story about not just science-based, but a lot of the individuals that would get up and talk about their successes, those were anecdotal evidences, right? So individuals like Joel Salatin, I don't know if you've ever heard of him or not, in Virginia. So he's both a farmer and an author, or Elliot Coleman, Gary Zimmer. All of those individuals are farmers. They're successful farmers, but they weren't conducting the science per se, right? But those anecdotal evidence does carry some weight in my mind, because that was being done outside in the real world, and they were having success with it. So that's the first one that I found that they're doing. And the second one is biochar. How many of you have heard of biochar? A couple of you, yay. This study is actually directed by our head department. The department head, his name is Amit Dhingra. He is almost as new as I am. I've been in Dallas for about 1.5 years. He's been, I think, in College Station for about 2 years. He came from Washington State. They had already been working on some of this. And so this is a collaboration between Washington State University and University of California at Riverside. So once again, just so I can kind of get into the study, I thought I would explain what biochar is for those of you that are not familiar with it. You'll notice that it looks very similar to charcoal. And when we are sitting around a fire and slowly those logs start to sort of burn off, and then we come in the next morning and not everything burnt, but we do have those little charcoal pieces, right? It's a similar process, except that in our camp fire, the chemical reaction was occurring in the presence of oxygen. In this case, with biochar, it happens inside a vat, if you will, or a reactor, and it's through pyrolysis. So it's very high heat, but this time it's in the absence of oxygen. So because there's no oxygen, the carbon gets sequestered, gets locked into the biochar matrix. In our fire camp, our fire, it would actually turn into carbon dioxide as it combines with oxygen. And then, of course, we have the green gases that we all don't want to put in the air. So this is a very nice finding, if you will. I mean, I think it's been around. I was reading that the first time they realized that this existed was when they went to the Amazon, and some tribes in the Amazon, they don't know if they were doing it on purpose or if it was just one of those things where they were trying to cook it in a certain way and there was no oxygen. But the point is that we can do it here now with machines. It starts, yes.
Actually, tribes in the Amazon invented this over 1,000 years ago.
Okay, so they actually came up with that. Okay, yeah.
They've been practicing that kind of agriculture using
biochar. Okay, yeah. Well, good. Thank you. Yeah, that paper said they weren't sure. So let's let him know that. And of course, I guess what I failed to mention is that we do start with organic matter, right? So it could be like wheat chaff or manure or, some sort of rice hull or anything that's a waste, an organic waste would get incorporated in here. The heat would go up, and to boot, we get actual heat and we could get electricity out of this process. So that's even better. So we know from studies that, well, I think I skipped something. No? Okay, maybe I put it wrong. We know from many studies around the country that when biochar is incorporated into the soil, we end up with some really healthy, strong looking plants. And so you can see on the right, you have tomatoes that have been treated with biochar. On the left, we have the control. So you can kind of see the difference. This is probably only like a 2-month-old tomato or so, right? They're not up yet. But from all the different studies, it is known, or at least suggested why it works. It's sequestering carbon, it's retaining water, it's reducing that fertilizer leaching, etc. And so the value really is summarized in this list here. But this group at A&M and Washington State and University of California kind of wanted to look at what was happening at the microbial level, because they suspected that that's may be where the changes are occurring. So they used this new technology, and I think I'm going to say the word one time, and then I'm going to just call it Technique A. But metagenomics, right? So that's Technique A. With metagenomics, you're actually looking at the genetic fingerprint, if you will, of a microbial community. And that microbial community that they studied exists around the rhizosphere, where the root of the plant is. So when I get results back from a metagenomic study, I can tell that I have, microorganism A through D, A, B, C, D, E. And so I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's great that I have all of those microorganisms. But if I go back up here to our little picture, our picture of the tomatoes, come on. If I did a metagenomics on this row and this row, they may come back and they may both show that I have microorganisms A through E and A through E. So that wouldn't explain the difference between this, right? So that is why we go to that next biotechnology, which is called metatranscriptomics. I'm going to call that Technique B. Now, instead of looking at the DNA, right, we're looking at the RNA, right? And so if you remember from your 9th grade biology, the messenger RNA is the cook that runs to the kitchen and goes, what should I cook? And so the chef gives mRNA the recipe that he should cook that day. And so that mRNA runs and starts to prepare it, right? So just because I have, 10 cooking books, I'm not going to prepare the recipes in the 10 cooking books every day. I'm only going to prepare a recipe when it's needed, right? So that's what the metatranscriptomics is helping us look into. It's like, what is going on in these two treatments, in the control and the biochar treatment? It is going to show me which one of those, A, B, C, D, E, is actually active. They're there, but are they active? They are there, but maybe they're more active or less active, right? And so those are the kinds of results that they will get through this type of work. So it basically also, they can go into the tissue of the plant and also figure out how is the plant responding to that recipe, right? Is it going, ooh, yum, or is it going, don't give it to me, right? So that way they can kind of really go deep into at the molecular level to figure out what is going on. So here are my little smiley faces. Instead of putting charts and all kinds of graphs, I decided to transmit the information with smiley faces. This is the name, the long name of the paper that just, it's not even published. I talked to Dr. Dingra over the weekend and I was like, could you please send me your proof? And he did, so that was very grateful. But you can see that they have only one, not, he's not happy, he's not sad. It was a neutral result. And the neutral result has to do, I'm sorry about the wording being so small, that says shoot biomass or fruit production. So there was no difference for this study in the amount of shoots or fruits. It wasn't less, it wasn't more. Now that's kind of different from other studies. As you saw in the picture, many times there are a lot more, but for them, there wasn't. But all of the other happy faces are good news for the group. So several bacteria that have known benefits to soil health and plant growth, they did display increased function. So that was a good one. Also, pathogenic fungi, the bad guys, their gene expression actually went down. So that was a good thing for that they wanted to see. So compared to the control, the fungi actually went down. They're suspecting that it's the competition of the good bacteria that went up. And when they looked at the tomato roots, they again basically saw that the genes that are associated with the function of nitrogen metabolism, with just regulation of metabolic processes, and also the production of organic compounds, that all also went up. So this is very preliminary work, but it's sort of the typical, what they say is these are promising results. It's what scientists like to say. And it all points to the fact that biochar as an amendment may enhance the gene expression of the beneficial soil microbes and also those plant roots that in turn, of course, lead into healthier soil and more better crop production and the plant health. So that's number 2. The final research, gosh, I think I'm going to go way over, is this one here. This was most close to my heart because my project actually had to do with green lacewings back in Oregon. So you all know what a little green lacewing looks like, right? And then our famous crepe myrtle bark scale. How many of you have had that on your crepe myrtles? A couple of you, okay. So the problem with these guys, as you all know, is that they're very tiny. They can hide in crevices, right? So spraying them is not very helpful. Also, the females have that waxy protective covering over them. The males, when they get the later instars, as they get older, they also develop a waxy covering. So spraying something on them does not help either. And on top of that, they're very fecund. So they reproduce, like mice, no, worse than mice. So you can see that it can get bad very quickly, right? We all know that we could potentially use neonics on something like a crepe myrtle because it's a systemic pesticide that's going to be taken through the root, into the stem, the shoots, the leaves, and kill these guys, right? Because they have their little mouth part inserted into the stem, into the phloem area that's carrying the sugars from the leaves down to the roots, and they would get those neonics in them and kill them. But what do we know about systemics? They go into the entire plant, right? They don't stop just at the leaf and the stem. They go into the flower, they go into the nectar, they go into the pollen. And our friends, the bees, both non-native and native, they do rely on crepe myrtles quite a bit, especially around this time of the year when we don't have a whole lot flowering. And so we don't want to use neonics because we want to make sure those pollinators are healthy and we keep those populations healthy. So this group at A&M, Dr. Wu, with the Department of Horticulture, decided to look at possible alternatives for control. And what they decided to do was look at what's called biocontrol. So let's look at predators that are out there that may naturally go after these guys. So what they did was they went in around College Station and looked at all the crepe myrtles and tried to find them. And lo and behold, they did find them. You can see, I don't know if you can see well, but this is the larva of the green lace one. This is what they look like. They look like little alligators, and they have their mandibles are like these hooks. And they have they're very quick. They walk along. And as soon as they come across a pest, they'll grab it with their mandibles and just start to suck their insides. And depending on the size of the pest, it takes them anywhere between a minute, 2 minutes, sometimes even 10 minutes. When I was doing my pest, it sometimes would take them like 10 minutes to completely suck that pest dry. And then here are the eggs. So this was all good news that they already are doing in nature what we want them to do. But to confirm, they brought them inside, they put them in a petri dish. And yes, the very top, you can see this is the female, and they're getting after her. These are eggs right here on the second layer, and then on the third layer, those are small, what they call crawlers, right? So they're just little nymphs. I don't think you can see their antennae. It's not clear enough, but they are attacking all of the stages, and they are doing it in a ravenous way. They just, are very good at that. The last experiment they conducted was with this Y tube, and basically they were wondering if they would also feed on them at night. Do they have to be able to see them, or are they smelling them, or is there other kind of cues that they're picking up from the pest? And so this was the loading test tube. We had some bark scale nymphs over here. So this was kind of the bait. And then over here, this test tube was a control. There wasn't anything. And so they stuck these Y tubes in boxes, and they turned off the light, and they came back the next day. And 78% of them went ahead and fed on those bark scale nymphs. And so they now know that it has to be some sort of olfactory cue that they're using. And so that's good. If they're going to hunt them day and night, then we may be able to release them. And the good news for us as homeowners is that these are sold commercially. So you can purchase them from something like Arbico is the only one that pops into my head, but I know that there are many more. You could call them, and they would send you a container with these guys, but they would be separated. Like adults, they will send them all together. But the larvae have to be separated into what they call hex cells, because if they're together, they're cannibalistic. They will eat each other. That is why, actually, I thought that this is a good factoid. They think that the reason the egg has developed or evolved this way is because if all the eggs were together as they're hatching, the brother and sister would start just like all the eggs that are in that area, right? But if they're at the top of this, then they just kind of, hatch, fall, and then they don't really see what else is around, and they just take off. So they really believe this is an evolution or adaptation to the cannibalism. Adult?
Not the ones that are doing all
the larvae,
Yeah, they eat other things besides this.
Yes, they're generalists. So that's another good news, because if they do a really good job of wiping everything out, then, but by then they probably have already gone through metamorphosis, and because they do progress quickly. If I remember right, they go from egg to adult in 1 month. So in 1 month you would have it, and so if they haven't cleaned up your crepe myrtle by then, you would have to get a second shipment of them. So okay, so let me switch over to the teaching of earth-kind gardening or earth-kind landscaping. Again, I'm not going to go through every single one. I just kind of wanted to highlight what we do throughout the year, and with the help of the master gardeners. They have been really good about sharing that knowledge with the community, and it applies to all of us, no matter what type of gardening we do. So we're basically trying to teach natural resource conservation at the neighborhood level. There are 10 steps, sometimes 12, depending on how you kind of slice the cake, but the goals are to conserve water and energy, reduce fertilizer and pesticide use, and also recycle the landscape waste that we produce in our own yards. So here are the 10, and I love to put things into boxes. It just helps me understand things better. And also because I wanted to relate it back to what we were talking a little while ago about nature's way, right? It all goes back to how would nature do things. And so when it comes to plant site selection, we want to make sure that we're taking into consideration the sun, the water availability. We want to make sure that we are considering the type of soil and whether we have to amend the soil. And importantly to this group, it would be what kind of plants you're going to put in the ground, right? We want to make sure that they are adapted to our region. And then mulch. So this all goes back to those first two that we were talking about, right? To armor the soil, to make sure that there's not a whole lot of mechanical disruption. So we're trying to set it up so that once it's established, we don't have to touch it a lot more. We just want to let it go and let it succeed because we've done it the right way. Oops. All right. The second group all has to do with water conservation. Top of mind around here, everywhere, I think around the country these days, we teach why and how to use low volume irrigation. We point out that an irrigation audit could be done by the city of Dallas if folks are interested. And I do have a resource link at the end. If you want to take a picture, you're welcome to do that. We talk about setting your irrigation controllers on a soak and cycle setting. And that's basically goes back to the fact that we have mostly clay soils around here. So it doesn't help to run your system for 30 minutes because you all know, I think you've all experienced this, right? Water just does not percolate or infiltrate clay very easily. And so it might just go a couple of inches, and then for the next 28 minutes, it's just running off into the street. And so we teach folks to run it maybe 10, 15 minutes and then hit it back again a few hours later because there's already a certain level of moisture in that soil column, and it's going to be much easier for those water molecules to percolate and infiltrate. So we spent quite a bit of time explaining that. Some folks sometimes are interested in rainwater harvesting. We talk about that too, especially for the downpours that we get, that hopefully we'll start to get soon. The third one is about that nutrient cycling, right, via biology. And I always like to start out with encouraging folks to compost, right? Use what you have. Start your own piles. You can go to a whole class about composting. Maybe you can become a master composter. But if individuals don't want to do that, or if people are still a little concerned about their, what macro minerals and micro minerals are in the soil, then we will suggest to do a soil test before they start to add fertilizers, right? So that we're not just putting anything in there. And especially sometimes people think, well, and I'm sure you've heard this, a little bit is good. A little bit more is even better. Let's just put the whole bag, right? And so we want to discourage folks from doing that and just say, let's really work with nature and just give it what it needs. Most of the times, if you are really composting, you have a good composting system, you will not need to add fertilizer. Sometimes there are some crops, I seem to remember strawberries require boron. So if you were in production mode, for example, if you had a farm, you would want to add the microelement boron. But for most of us, if we have some good compost that we can add once or twice a year to our landscapes, then you are in shape. Or we could also buy it from the soil yards that exist around here. Then we have IPM to control pest diseases as a separate item. That's kind of the environmental services, right? The checks and balances. If we make sure that we have a habitat, they will come type thing. The story I always like to tell is I used to sell vegetables at a farmer's market, and the first year that I got my bed started, it was in a backyard. There was not a whole lot going on, and my very first crop of lettuce got attacked fairly frequently by slugs. And so, but I didn't put any chemicals down. I was, determined to do it the organic way. And so the next year, doing some research, I realized that if I could attract toads and frogs to my garden, they would take care of the slugs. And so convinced my hubby to put in a little pond on one end. And that took forever, but it finally worked. And the following year, I didn't even think about it. I didn't have any problems with the lettuce, no slugs. And then suddenly, when it actually hit me was one evening when I was looking around towards the pond, and there were like 5 different frogs just sitting out there. And so I was like, oh yeah, that's right. That's why I put that in there. So it does work. Sometimes it takes 3 to 4 years to build a good ecosystem that really has all of those links, if you will. So we encourage people to do that when we go into this topic. And then finally, the turf maintenance is its own topic, because most of us have turf and most of us have problems with our grasses, etc. So we also talk a little bit about that. I was going to go into a little more about integrated pest management. I think I have 10 minutes. Would you like me to continue? Yes? Okay. All right. So again, this is kind of my line of work and study. So that's why I wanted to go into it a little bit more. When it comes to integrated pest management, I'm sure you've all seen the pyramid, right? And I'm going to show you that in just a minute. But what's important to realize is that there are other components that make an IPM program successful. So of course we want to do prevention, and that is actually part of the pyramid, but we must monitor, right? We need to be outside in the garden or in the community garden or in the TDG or wherever we work on a regular basis, because otherwise we are not going to notice the changes. And the next time we come out, suddenly it's going to be a surprise, right? So whatever is gone. So monitoring is important. Sometimes we can do it if we have the time, but farmers, for example, rely on traps, different types of trapping, so they can do monitoring. Sometimes they'll hire scouts that come maybe once out to the farm once a week, and they are the ones in charge of monitoring. So that's kind of key. The second thing, I think I have some numbers. There we go. So the third thing that's of importance is pest identification, right? Because if we don't know what pest we are treating, we need to do some research. We need to know, is it a chewer? Is it a sucker? Is it going to, what is what's called the phenology? So what's the timeline? If we decide to use biocontrol, if I want to release some parasitoids, then I need to know when that there's going to be a overlap of the stages. That's a little more complicated, but pest identification is key. So whenever we have our Master Gardener intern program, we always remind our Master Gardeners, please, when you get calls at the help desk, make sure you ask the homeowner to send pictures, right? Because maybe they don't know what it is, but with lots of good pictures, we can figure out what it is and then take it from there. Now, the next one, the number 4 component, is an action threshold. Farmers have used this for years, and now we're starting to kind of make homeowners aware of this idea. Farmers have very strict numbers when they go into action with several things. But when it comes to us, to the homeowners, the threshold is up to each one of us. So for example, let's say that I have a patch of kale, right? And I say, well, maybe if 20% of it is eaten, I'm not going to bother. I'm not going to lift a finger, right? And I'm okay with it, right? Because I can just chop it up and saute it, and my kids will never know that the leaves had holes in them, right? But as a market gardener, when I was selling my produce, I had to kind of at one point make a decision, right? And say, okay, well, maybe 40, maybe 50% max, because otherwise I show up at the farmer's market and people are going to look at this produce and go, I'm paying for holes. I mean, so it's up to you when you want to jump into action. Sometimes at gatherings like this, I will have people come up to me and they were like, I have a little hole in my sweet potato leaf. And I'm like, one hole? And they're like, yes. I'm like, not time to panic. So it depends on the plant. It depends on where you have it, maybe front yard versus backyard. The threshold is up to you. Also, it's a timing. Several months ago, I went to Bontom Farms and I was just visiting, and the individual came up to me and said, I think we have a problem with some moth. And sure, yes, they did. There were some holes, and he wanted to know what to do with it. But when I started turning the leaves over, I realized that the larva had already transitioned to the pupa. So even if they sprayed something, it wasn't going to make a difference at that point because the larva had already done its damage, right? So for that reason, thresholds, timing, identification, all of those elements come into play. And finally, we do have the pest control tactics, right? That's where the pyramid comes in. So here is that pyramid. And cultural is this broad term that has to do, again, mainly with prevention. So it could be, again, that plant selection, making sure it's the right plant, making sure that you're putting it in a good site, that it's not maybe going to flood, for example. You're not going to keep roots in the water all the time. You have to kind of walk your land to make sure that you are doing it in the right place. Sanitation is also considered a cultural control. What is sanitation? Well, at the end of a season, when those plants are kind of senescing, when everything is starting to die off and things are falling to the soil, we want to make sure we collect all of that, especially if we had disease, and put it in a bag and put it in the trash. Don't compost it. I know sometimes we have mulches, right? We've talked a lot about mulches. And so it's sometimes kind of hard to decide, well, should I collect all of the mulch and put it in the trash? What should I do? And again, it all depends on how the season has gone. If you had a really bad case of some sort of fungal outbreak, then I would say, yes, just take everything, because now your mulch is full of the spores of that fungus. And next season, you're going to start at a disadvantage because, of course, we know spores can fly in. We cannot prevent that, but let's not start with the spores in our beds, right? So that's what sanitation is. When I worked in Oregon, I worked for blueberry farms, and those workers, after the harvest season was over, of course, there's lots of blueberries, what they call spent fruit, right? Just fruit that fell, maybe the birds came in and made a mess. They were an organic farm. They had a whole crew going through acres and acres and acres, cleaning up all that fruit. Because if they left it in the ground, the following spring, early in the spring, the spotted winged Drosophila, the fruit fly, would start earlier and earlier in the season. And it's become a huge problem. Whereas 7 years ago, they used to spray only once to keep that under control. Now they're having to spray 7 and 8 times in a season. So the farmers are really, really wanting, and of course, resistance is starting to occur. So now they're really putting an emphasis on these cultural controls, right? Rotations, maybe for us in our smaller yards, rotations may not make a lot of sense, especially when it comes to insects, because they fly, so they can just go from bed A to bed from bed A to bed B. Again, as I just mentioned, spores can just kind of fly through the air, so rotation may not be, called for. In our case, I think the only time that rotation may be beneficial is if you had nematodes, because those guys, of course, can't really crawl too far. They're really tiny round worms that they'll just stay in that root area. So you may want to rotate crops with a nematode problem. So for those of you who have seen this before, you notice that now that I'm going to go to the next level, we're starting to go from a prevention to more of an intervention. And also notice that we start to go to a higher toxicity when we end up at the chemical level, right, with treatment. Physical, mechanical, that could just be as easy as picking off a caterpillar of a plant, right? That's just hand picking. We could be pruning to open up the canopy of a tree or a bush. If we have fruit trees, for example, if it's open, it won't be as moist. Many insects need the moisture both to fly and also to lay eggs. If it's very dry, they'll be like, no, I really don't like it here. I'm going to go look for something else. So pruning is another IPM strategy. Weeding, some weeds can be alternative hosts to some of our pests. So it's a good idea to remove weeds, not only in our yards, but if you have a neighbor that's not weeding, you may want to kind of buy him a donut and then say, hey, those weeds really need to be pulled out, because they may hold that pest from one season to the next, right? So you may not have the plant that is actually being a problem to, but it's on the weed. And as soon as your plant comes back up, it's going to come back. So that's what is known as an alternative host. Traps, barriers, flaming. So anything that's mechanical. And some of these we probably wouldn't want to use in our neighborhoods. I don't think flaming, the HOAs wouldn't be too happy with that. Katerina did not say that you could flame your backyards, okay? Biological, this is predators, parasites, nematodes. And again, in a minute, I'm going to show you a link of a very good website that talks about all the types of biocontrol. And also, it's a summary of all the companies across the country. The only thing, again, is they're not the easiest to use. You do have to have a little more knowledge of what eats what and when to release them. I really like the green lacewing. They do a really nice job. As some of you may know, ladybugs seem to have a mind of their own. You release them and they're like, bye. There's supposed to be ways to keep them in your yard. And I've tried them, but they still sort of disappear. So I don't know if they sell minute pirate bugs, but they are also very good predators. And so there are many things that can be used. And parasitoids, the little wasps that will lay eggs into other insects. Those are also, they are commercially available. And if you have a greenhouse, for example, you would want to use that in a greenhouse. Okay, and then finally, of course, we get to the chemical apex there. And as you may know, there are some chemicals that are softer, some that are harder, or some that are harsh. Usually the harsh ones are the ones we consider broad spectrum. Basically, they will kill anything that's out there. We discourage people from using them, but if they do absolutely have to, then we say just make sure you read the label. The label is a law, and then make sure that they answer certain questions that they need to check. Just because it says it treats everything, it may not treat the exact pest or the exact crop that you have. So you have to open up that little label and make sure that it's listed. If it's not listed, then you should, in theory, not be using it. Soaps, oils, baking soda, repellents, all of those are considered softer chemicals because they don't target everything out there, right? They're not usually systemic, so they're not going into the plant and lasting for a whole year. They just will, they will basically decay very quickly after they have acted on the pest. Microbials are the ones that you know as BT. If you've ever used BT for the lepidopterans, for the moths and such, there are different strains of microbials, especially when it comes to the BT. There's one for Lepidoptera, which is the moths and butterflies, Coleoptera, which are the beetles. That's a different strain. And then the mosquitoes, that's a different strain. So there are 3 different strains right now. There may be a 4th that I'm not remembering, but the donuts that you guys buy to put in water, that's a type of BT that's a strain specifically for mosquitoes. And so those again are considered, yes, they're chemical, but they are softer chemicals and they're very targeted, right? They're just targeting mosquitoes, nothing else will be impacted. The IGRs, those are insect growth regulators. Those are targeting the metamorphosis of the insect. So it kind of puts a dent in the growth of the insect, if you will. So again, that because it's at a biological level and it's again very targeted, it's considered as a softer chemical. One more thing I want to make sure I mention, the mulches. I know that you are all familiar with why we mulch, probably, right? Because it really helps retain water, because it prevents weeds from growing. But an additional benefit when it comes to insects is that many insects, when they're in the larval stage and they're ready to go into the pupal stage, they will drop from the plant to the soil and they will pupate in the soil. But if you have 2 to 3 inches of woody mulch, that larva will fall and maybe it'll try to wiggle itself through some of that wood, but it's 2 or 3 inches. It's a lot of a distance for a tiny little larva. And so they will dehydrate and they will die. So with mulch, you are breaking the life cycle of a lot of the pests that we have around here. So that's another good reason to use it. I thought I would bring this up, and I know you cannot read it, but I will, I will describe what you're looking at. This is, it's called the Earthkind landscaping tool. A&M has it on their website. And basically, it helps you select plants for your region. So you go onto it, and then you can just either click on the map, or you can just put your zip code here. And so I brought up the second web page. It just says, North and Central Texas. And then I said, okay, well, I want something that does well in part shade. And I want it in the fall. And I don't remember what else I put as a characteristic. I don't remember what it was, but anyway, you can decide, what you're looking for specifically. And at the bottom, you can get an entire list, or you can get the top 8 plants that A&M, they have like an Earthkind index that goes from 10 to 0, 10 being the best, 0 being the worst. So, and this is what comes up. So you can see they're recommending Turk's Cap, Mexican mint marigold, even though I think there's a spelling problem there. Mexican hat, salvia, and sages, and there were several others, but of course I only copied the first 4. So if you are not familiar with this, you may be interested in looking at it. I have to say, I was disappointed with the grasses. I went in to see what the grasses would be, and there was 1 grass. I don't know if I did it wrong. I didn't have time to check it, but if that's the case, somebody needs to be made aware of that, because I cannot believe that you all would be able to answer that. I'm sure there are many more grasses in this area, but just 1. And if it was up to me, I would, the master gardeners know this, I would just do away with all the turf that we have around here and, put some grasses out there that are natives that won't require as much water. So here are the references of all the different studies that I brought up today. Here are those resources. I will leave it there for a little while if you want to. Again, I'm not supposed to be recommending any specific company, so I put 3 companies instead, and I didn't realize that would came off like that. Here's a soil testing link. We, just as with the landscape varieties, you can also go in and find vegetable varieties, fruit varieties. Here is the link for the biocontrol vendors. Here is the link for the irrigation evaluation. That's a free irrigation audit. And then turf grass mowing. This would be, if I would have gone into the turf maintenance portion of it, I would have given you this link so that you can, see how high you should be mowing. And usually people are mowing, too much. They need to kind of bring up that level of their lawnmower. So I think that's it for me, unless you have any questions, comments. Yes. I can share that with Janet. Do I share it with you? Yes. Okay.
Send it out.
Right, and the Zooms will also go out, videos go out to YouTube.
Okay. Yes.
Please get in on that irrigation.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if that's a city of Dallas. And so it might be very limited to where, and again, being new to Dallas, I'm not sure. I imagine Richardson is not part of city of Dallas. No. Okay. Yeah. But you can also do your own audit. There's the little where you save all your tuna cans and then put them at a certain distance, and you run the system for a little while. And this, depending on how much, and usually the issue could be that, something's not going all the way. So there's a corner over here that's not being irrigated. And so that little tuna can will get, it won't get any water. So those are the kind of thing that you could do by yourself that will actually be obvious to you. If that, one is filling up a whole lot more than another, you may want to look into that. Yeah. And again, I'm pretty sure that we have how to do that online. I'll try to include that document when I send it to Janet, that it shows you exactly how to do that if you need it. Yes.
Going back to the biochar, I mean, I'd heard the word, but I didn't really know anything about it. What about the energy inputs needed to make that? Is what comes out?
Right,
Does it balance out?
I don't know, like a total accounting of energy.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know the answer to that. That is a good question. It could be that it could be a closed loop, so whatever energy is coming out could be used to heat it. Just one guess.
Can you buy biochar? I've heard of it, but like, are there more legitimate and less legitimate sources?
I don't know if it's commercially available yet. Does anybody know? I know that we are going to be getting it at, so in Garland, we have a area that we call the urban farm, and we have a vineyard out there. And so they want to study, just kind of like the tomato study, they want to do it with the vineyard. It's what's called an earth kind vineyard. So for 5 years, the irrigation was extremely low. They did not irrigate and they did not fertilize. The vineyard is now out of that study, and so they want to transition it into a new study with biochar. And I believe that they're going to be dropping it off in bulk. And so that leads me to say that maybe it's not available yet in bags, because otherwise they would have probably delivered it in bags. Oh, it is available? Okay. It's probably pretty expensive because I think the vats are huge and they're probably pretty expensive.
Not researched it.
And it also, you do want to be aware of what was the starting organic waste, because I saw in that research paper that can influence what the biochar is actually doing for the plant. So I don't think is an exact science at this point, and maybe that's why it's not really widely available, because what may work for a tomato plant may not work for a blueberry plant, that kind of thing. So they may want to kind of zero in on that before they start putting it out on the market. They're good questions, especially the energy one. Yes.
Do y'all still recommend expanded shale?
Yes, for clay. Absolutely. So yeah, if you have clay only and you're going to do some kind of in-ground work, the way to add porosity and to increase the behavior, or to improve the water behavior, if you will, is to make sure that you put like 3 inches of expanded shale on top of the clay and do your best to mix it in. That's the hard part, right? As well as compost, because the compost is also going to help with the creation of what they call aggregates, right? So make it that tilth kind that we all want for our soils. But eventually, it's hard at first, but I've certainly seen the results years later, and it does definitely break it up. And even with compost alone, but it's a lot more gummy. So I think and the water probably would not behave well at first. So we need to add that space. And that's what the expanded shale does. And expanded shale is available commercially, but it is kind of, again, on the expensive side. That's unless you raise your beds, that's really what you need to do if you want to do in-ground gardening.
And you're talking really about vegetable gardening is that what you're
yeah, I mean, well, I would also say and for native species, if you're going to put them, of course, they should do okay, right? You don't need to baby them. In fact, I think sometimes when you baby native species, they don't like it. But if you like plants, ornamental plants that are not necessarily, adapted to this area, then you may want to increase the tilth of that soil. Yeah.
Regenerative gardening, if practiced, for some years, will actually increase the tilth of the soil too.
Right, right. Yeah, that is what we're after for sure. So do you have a question back there? No, you're scratching. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I think it's, whenever I used to garden for market, that was the favorite part of the year for me was adding amendments back to it because I felt it was like a full circle, was giving back. Especially with food crops, we're taking out. And if you're doing intensively, then you have to kind of stay on top of it even more so. So hopefully these individuals at, with Texas and Oklahoma study, they will figure out a good way to replenish those soils so that it's economically advantageous to them, but that we can keep that ecology in there. So, yeah.